Hi, and welcome to another episode in the Destination Rural podcast series. I'm Peter Rutherford. I'm the CEO of the Rural Doctors Association of Australia. And in this episode, we're going to be talking to RDAA's immediate past president, Dr. John Hall, to hear about his rural medical career journey, where it started, who his influences were, and where to next for Dr. Hall. Thanks, John, for joining us on our Destination Rural podcast series. I'd just like to kick off, like a lot of people know you and know who you are, seen you on telly and the whole, heard you on the radio or seen you in the newspaper, but just really interested about your background story, like, where you grew up, what your parents did, and why you chose medicine.
Thanks, Peter. Look, it's great to be here and great to be part of the Destination Rural podcast series. I've had a pretty eclectic past in terms of where I've been and what I've done, but I was born in central Queensland in Emerald. My dad was the Anglican minister out there. That's why we were living in Emerald, and they actually worked there for about 6 or 7 years before I was born, and we left about a year after I was born and went, my parents, I'm one of 10 siblings. At the time, I was the 5th baby, and mum had just had the 6th. So a year after I was born, and they took 6 small children, 6 small children who were, pretty much 6 under 10 years old to England. So they flew us to the UK. Dad's relatives and mum's family come from the UK, and they always wanted to do some work over there. And he got a parish in Brighton, which is on the south coast of England, in a fairly low socioeconomic area. So we went from sort of central Queensland, 45 degrees in the summer to freezing cold UK. Brighton, it was a culture shock, and we were there for 7 years. So there for some time, and then we came back to Australia when I was around about 7 and a half, and straight back into rural Queensland. Dad was working in Inglewood, with where Col Owen, the famous Col Owen, works medically. So was there for 2 years after we got back. So I did sort of would have been grade 3 and grade 4 in Inglewood, and absolutely loved it. There was 7 of us at the time then. So mum had another child not long after we got back to Australia. And we run amok in Inglewood, basically off the chain, riding all over the town, going to the pool whenever we wanted, and really enjoyed the freedom of country life there. And then after that, moved back to Brisbane. Dad was the chaplain for St Margaret's School for 12 months, and then he got a parish in suburban north side Brisbane in Strathpine, where I pretty much did most of my sort of teenage growing up. But I do think those roots in central Queensland and Emerald, and the stories from mum and dad, and then living in Inglewood really did give me a taste for country life, and sort of just knew that my roots were in the country from there, and having enjoyed that, and the family having enjoyed working in rural Australia. I think that really was part of what set me on the path.
So you mentioned growing up, or spending some time in your childhood Inglewood, and you mentioned the infamous Col Owen, who we all know and love. But did you have like an early career mentor, like a doctor that you whether it was a family member or a family friend or just your GP, family GP? Obviously, your mum with 10 kids would have been at the doctors a lot with I dare say, a few childhood injuries. But yeah, just, did you have a mentor or an early career mentor, and what sort of influence did they have, and how important was it?
Yeah, look, absolutely. There's a couple of points of reference here. My mum was a nurse, and she was a nurse and did a lot of nursing in Winton in central Queensland, or northern western Queensland, and she trained at St Helens, which is a private hospital in Brisbane that doesn't exist anymore. But interestingly, she describes a path to rural nursing, which is very much akin to sort of rural generalist nursing. The nurses back in the day knew that if they went rural, they had to have a broad range of skills. So she reports stories of them having to have midwifery, having to have done a child health certificate, and having to be skilled in general nursing to go out there. So we had those conversations throughout growing up, and Mum recounted a lot of stories of her nursing in Winton. I think, the other person who influenced me was Cole, in fact. So when we were children in Inglewood, Cole was our family doctor. And with Dad's role at the church, he got to know Cole sort of professionally. And so we actually went round to Cole's place a few times as a family when we were little children. And I have vivid memories of Cole sort of, getting up in the middle of dinner and going out and taking calls, or having to go to the hospital, or, even sometimes being on, having to go off to a teleconference. Didn't even know what they were back in the day. So Cole certainly had an influence on my thinking of rural medicine as a profession, but so did my mum. Also, when I was a medical student, I was on the AMA mentor program, and I was assigned a cardiologist from Brisbane, Dr. Goodwin, and he was fascinating. He'd actually spent time in New Guinea in World War II, and actually spent his early career rurally, as many of the older specialists in Brisbane had back in the day. Many of the specialists in Brisbane did do early career work rurally, and they understood the value in it. They understood the value of clinical autonomy. They understood the fact that it would give them a strong general base, and the fact that they would understand their referral base as well. But I think back in the day too, the relative income was better. So a lot of specialists would go out, earn some good money in the bush to fund their specialty training. So I think there are a number of factors that led to that phenomenon, but it certainly was a phenomenon, having spoken to Dr. Goodwin about that on a number of occasions. But he had some fascinating stories from his time in New Guinea in the war. He ended up giving me a little book which he wrote around what happened in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese and during the occupation, and he was actually in one of the concentration camps. So yeah, fascinating story. But anyway, that's a little bit about.
I can't believe you didn't end up in the army as a then.
Well, I think the Army's got a number of colleagues that have gone through the Army, and I think these days when they're not deployed as much, it probably wouldn't be the same as what it was back in the day.
So you mentioned about specialists in Brisbane and that doing their rural too. Do you think it's something that we've lost? We often, with our Destination Rural campaign, we talk about, going rural for part of your career, whether it's early or later, or working rurally, it makes you a better doctor. Do you think it's something that we've lost?
Absolutely. And Mum, having worked in Winton, and she was working, would have been in the 60s, said that a lot of the junior doctors that she worked with then went on to become specialists in Brisbane, but they'd spent a few years in the country, as I mentioned before. I think we have lost something. I think it's really important for specialists to understand their referral base. And we've all had the experience of specialists that have never been west of the Great Divide, who don't understand the context, who don't understand the challenges. And they're always more difficult to deal with or difficult to refer to when they don't understand that. But I think it's more than that. I think we've lost that value, that early career value of clinical autonomy. When you're working in large metro hospitals and there's lots of doctors around you and there's lots of competition for work, I think today in particular, with the significant increase in doctors in these hospitals, people aren't getting exposed to that frontline work as much. They're not getting exposed to the undifferentiated patient and having to work patients up from scratch. And I think that's one of the things you definitely get in the bush, is that you're having to deal with whatever comes through the door. You're having to work with the genuinely undifferentiated patient. And I think that is formative for clinicians to actually take a problem from scratch and work it up. And, you know, of course you don't, you know, as junior doctors, you don't have to know everything, but you certainly need to be a really good historian, and you need to be someone that can do a good examination and then communicate that back to a specialist or a colleague and build a story. So I think those skills, building those skills in the bush is invaluable. And I think we really have lost that. And what we've done instead to build the workforce is take people or force people to go rurally that don't have the skill set. Potentially, I think, it's not a value add for them, but there's this sort of massive cohort of junior doctors who I think could get a lot of value out of some early career exposure.
So just as a senior doctor, like, you've got junior doctors who may be considering rural, but worry that, and they do hear the stories of the past where, older generation were thrown out there, they were on their own and unsupported. What's it like now? Like, as a supervisor, what's sort of the experience like now? Is it similar, or is it, much different, I guess, for those that do actually go rural?
Look, I've been recently working in St George, and I would say to the audience that the medium-sized rural hospitals, sort of, I don't know if you know Queensland, like the Warwicks, the Dalbys, and places like even St George, where you've got a cohort of senior doctors and you've got layers of junior doctors underneath them right now, which is better than what it was when I started. We certainly didn't have as many junior doctors supporting us back in the day, but in these new models of care, junior doctors can come out here and they're very supported. I've recently come back from doing 2 weeks in St George, and we had an intern and a JHO working with us, and they were first on, and we would come straight in if they had a complex case. We had a gentleman who came in septic, and the PHO rang me and I was there, within 3 minutes. So you can still have that autonomy, but you've got that backup and support, so that you never feel out of your depth. And certainly throughout my career, I've worked regionally and rurally. And when I did my internship in Rockhampton, I was there for 2 years. When I was a JHO second year out, I was the senior doctor in Rockhampton emergency overnight on my own, or not on my own, with one intern helping me. But even throughout my career, when I've been in these sort of situations where you're having to be more clinically autonomous, I've always found that the senior doctors around have backed me all the way. I've never felt like I was out of my depth, or that the patients were put at risk because I was left alone, without the right skill set or without the right knowledge. So I think, and I think that's certainly true today. I think it's probably more true today that we're probably more careful about making sure that junior doctors or registrars have got better backup and support. So I would say in the modern era, it's actually safer and easier to get that experience, knowing that, if you do come out here, you'll have good support.
I want to turn the conversation a little bit different. I had the privilege of having dinner with you and your lovely wife, Tam, the other night, so that was nice. But Tam, she's a physio, and so how important was her support in you going rural? Like, was she able to find work, or did she, and I know, the halls have done their bit for the Australian population. So I know that you had, 4 kids just like while you were in medical school. Is that right?
Yep, correct.
Honestly, madness. But yeah, but just really the role, I guess, for Tam, and and what she's had to sort of do in relation to her career and things like that.
Yeah, look, we went into rural, professional practice eyes wide open. I took a Queensland Health Scholarship as a medical student. And part of that was because we needed the money, because we had 3 kids in med school and she had stopped working. So we were sort of relying on that to live and survive with a little bit of welfare top up. Back in the day, we were surviving on about 20 grand a year with 3 kids. But we part of the other reason why I took the scholarship, because it came with a funded 2-week placement every year. So we would get an opportunity to sort of live it and feel what it was like. So she came with me with the kids. We did placements in Inglewood, in Gladstone, and that was interesting, living out of nurses' quarters with 3 little children. Again, madness, but it gave us as a family, a taste for what it would be like. So, I didn't want to take Tam out into the country if it's something that really didn't suit her and the children, but we certainly learned pretty quickly that it would be a really good environment for a young family. And also being a physio, we knew that she would get work if she wanted to work. But to be honest, for the first sort of 5 or 6 years of the children, she had a very much full-time job looking after them. But she did end up getting some work as a physio in Stanthorpe and in a private practice there when we were settled there, and she really enjoyed that. So certainly opportunities were good, and also she was really comfortable with the fact that, particularly when the kids are really little, that it was an environment and a lifestyle that suited us really well with schooling and everything.
So you mentioned the kids being in Stanthorpe, like with the schooling, and again, these are things that come up about people worry about going rural. Can you send your kids to school? Is there good schooling? So I suppose you spent the younger years in Stanthorpe. Like, did you think about sending the kids to boarding school, or was the local schools, like the quality of the local schools, good? Or
we'd had discussions about boarding school, but it would have only been for high school. And again, it wasn't because we didn't have faith in the local schools. The only reason why we considered, other schools for high school, and really the reason why we ended up moving closer to a regional centre in the end, was about subject selection and extracurricular activities for our kids. So we had every faith in Stanthorpe State High to provide a really good academic education for our children. We knew that there'd been a number of other doctors, like the famous Richard Bonner, who's one of the rural legends out in Stanthorpe. All his kids went through Stanthorpe State High and did really well. And Dan Manahan's children went through the Catholic school in Stanthorpe, and all have been exquisitely successful and achieved really well academically. So I don't think academics per se on their own are a factor. And certainly the primary school was fantastic. But I think as for high school, the main challenge is around extracurricular activities, and it depends on the interests of your children. My children were very musical and into the arts, and they couldn't access the higher level ballet classes, and they couldn't access the range of musical instruments that they were interested in. So that was one of the factors that sort of led to us moving away from Stanthorpe, but that wasn't till high school. So for primary school, we were very, very happy with the quality of the schooling.
So some people sort of think, like once you go rural, you're there forever. And you mentioned, you moved to a larger regional town. Was it Toowoomba?
Yeah.
Yeah. For high school. But I guess, what do you sort of think that people, like when people sort of think that, that if you go rural, you're there forever. And I suppose just with consideration to the things you've done since you've left Stanthorpe, do you think there's truth in that, or is it about, that you're choosing, some people choose to stay in one rural town for a long time, where for you, it may be a bit different?
Yeah, look, I think this is a really important point because, there are a percentage of people that end pitch up in a town that they love, and they get integrated into the community, and yeah, they do stay for longer, but that's not for everybody. And I think if people think that that's what's expected, it may be a barrier to them going into rural practice. And we absolutely need all the workforce that we can get. And I think any rural experience is a massive value add, not only for you professionally in terms of what you get out of it, in terms of training and education, but also the experience. Even as a senior doctor, I never tire of the experience and the reward that I get back from working rurally. Like it's rewarding in and of itself, beyond the training aspect is what I'm trying to say there. So there's lots of professional value in working rurally, whether it's for for 30 years or whether it's for 5 to 10 years. And I think what my career has reflected, having sort of worked in the regions, gone to Stanthorpe for 5 years, then back to Toowoomba, but working in Oakey, which was a rural model of care, but close enough to a larger centre that the children could go to school, without having to board. And then sort of moving into practice ownership and then into clinical governance, being a director of medical services for a large corporate. It shows that the base training in rural practice through ACRM, the College of Rural and Remote Medicine, and what you learn and what you get can set you up for a very diverse career. And it doesn't have to be linear. It can be a career that weaves in and out of rural practice and in and out of different types of medical practice, from admin to business ownership to public hospital clinical governance, which I've done a fair bit of in my time as well. Working for the DDHHS as Director of Medical Services there for a time as well. So, there's a number of things, there's a number of places your career can take you, and often this stuff grows organically, and you can change models of care to suit the different phases of your life. So now I'm back beyond having worked in clinical governance, back to going back out and doing some fly in, fly out work rurally. So, I think that thinking about the non-linear career, but also thinking about post-rural career options for people, I think is really important. And whilst historically a lot of specialists did some time in the bush, I think there certainly is an opportunity now for people to spend some time rurally and go on and do another specialty. I'm currently training essentially towards a specialty in medical administration. So essentially that's a second specialty for me. There's lots of options for people to take on a second specialty mid-career. We work for over 30 years. Most of us are working for up to 40 years, and there's absolutely no reason why you can't mix it up and have a really diverse or non-linear career.
So mixing it up, I guess that's one of my other questions about in rural, how important is it to create that variety in your work? And do you think just your day-to-day work, because I know you're involved with advocacy, teaching and all those sorts of things. So important to have that variety in your work. And do you think it's easier to achieve that variety in a rural setting in comparison to an urban setting?
Oh, look, 100%. I think one of the challenges to sort of office-based general practice in the city is ironically, it can be very isolating. You're in the city, you're surrounded by millions of people, but at the end of the day, when you're working full-time in a busy general practice, you're in a 4-square room all day, every day, having very little interaction with other doctors, mostly with patients, unless you build structures that sort of make that happen. So a lot of GP colleagues that I have talk about this sort of isolation within the practice because of the nature of general practice. I think rurally, because you're working across the hospital setting, because you're often working in blended funding models where you're getting some salaried or some block funding, some hospital funding and some GP funding, you actually have an increased flexibility to spend more time, I guess, non-direct contact clinical time doing teaching. So I really enjoyed that opportunity in Stanthorpe, for instance, where I was primarily a salaried doctor, where, you know, we were really busy and often the busyness happened in the evenings. But, you know, we might have some quiet times during the day where we would get out the mannequins, do scenarios, teach juniors how to do procedures like putting in chest tubes. All that sort of stuff really did mix it up for me and made the job really interesting. And I think teaching is so important. One of the selfish reasons why I got into teaching from a very early stage in my career was because I was very much aware that it was a way of keeping yourself up to date. And when you're working rurally, you know, you need such a broad skill set that you're not going to be maintaining your experience or your numbers of procedures across a broad range of things all the time. And one way to beat that challenge is to do it in training, like run scenarios, you know, teach students how to put in chest tubes. So I probably put in about 100 fake chest tubes while I was in Stanthorpe teaching students, and maybe put in maybe 2 or 3 in anger on patients. But by doing that sort of thing, staying involved in hands-on teaching, it actually cuts across the challenge of staying up to date with clinical practice. Because I also find that students and registrars bring to your practice new knowledge, up-to-date knowledge, which is really often helpful. So we often learn a lot from our students and our registrars about up-to-date you know, clinical developments that we might not have learned when we were in medical school. So staying up to date and also staying current with a lot of the things across generalist practice, I think, you know, is a good reason to stay involved in teaching, and one of the big reasons why I stayed involved in teaching. And I certainly do think that the sort of varied nature of the work really gives you that opportunity to do that, but also to look at, you know, probably a bit more of opportunity and time to get involved in advocacy and medico-politics as well.
You, from a rural doctor's perspective, and I'll get into the advocacy in a little bit, but from the Rural Doctors Association of Australia, we have a strong position that, you know, rural medicine isn't better than, you know, urban-based GP or specialist medicine, but it is different. But now that you're no longer the RDAA president, tell us what you really think.
Oh, look, it's horses for courses as well, I think. And this is, you know, it's like saying, well, an orthopedic surgeon is better than a physician, or, you know, or a dermatologist is better than an ophthalmologist. I think, you know, I think that the silos are artificial in our profession. And I think there is a lot of interprofessional jealousy and there's a lot of interprofessional rivalry that really doesn't need to exist. And what we've often lobbied for and called for in rural practice is an uplift in pay and remuneration, not because we think rural doctors are better than their, you know, urban physician colleagues or urban GP colleagues, or even, you know, rural fly-in fly-out specialist colleagues. But it's actually about the fact, it's 2 things for me. It's the fact that the work is more challenging, and as I've already sort of alluded to, it requires us staying across a really broad range of things, not cognitively, but also physically, being able to stay current with a really broad range of procedures, from putting in chest tubes, central lines, intubating people, you know, instrumental birth deliveries, all of this sort of stuff. They're all physical skills that it's a real challenge to maintain your competency, but also the type of work or the nature of work in acute hospital settings often requires you to be available 24/7, to be called in after midnight. So not only is it a broad and more challenging skill set to stay on top of, often you're doing this in really unsociable hours. So these are all reasons why people don't like doing rural practice. Some people get into their mid-careers and they want to be more comfortable, they want work-life balance, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think when people choose to contribute, when people choose to be the doctors that will stand up and do this work, which I think is often more physically and socially challenging, then they need to be compensated for that. It's not to say rewarded as in it's better, but there needs to be compensation. And I think we're not going to get across some of these barriers around recruitment unless it's recognized that this stuff is challenging. It's challenging to stay on top of it. It's challenging to deliver, often in professionally isolated circumstances, austere circumstances where you might not have the resources and equipment and materials to do what you need to do, that needs to be rewarded. So we unashamedly, I've unashamedly always held the line that we do need to fund rural medicine better, and that there does need to be a differential and an uplift and better pay to compensate for these barriers. And I'm certain, I'm certain in my experience working for OCA, working around Australia and doing a number of different locums and seeing different models of care, that where people are rewarded and paid properly, whether it's through salaried state awards or whether it's through locums, when they're paid appropriately and they're rewarded for that difficulty of work, there's a workforce. So for people to sit back and say, oh, it's not about the money, I think is complete bullshit. I think, they're difficult jobs in the same way, I think there are city specialties that are under the same challenges. So, I know some people that are plastic and reconstructive surgeons in Brisbane that have to, might do all night operations, 14 hours reattaching hands and limbs and that type of thing. That sort of stuff pays really, really well, but it's also challenging and difficult, and it's in unsociable hours. So I think recognising and rewarding people, I think industrially for those challenges, I think is really important. And I think today we just don't do that in the bush. I think, we get paid well compared to, we're certainly getting paid really well compared to the average society. But where there's inequity, I think, is when you compare what a rural generalist gets paid on average across the nation to what some of our specialty colleagues working in some of the difficult surgical specialties and the like in the city, there's still a massive discrepancy. So I think my view is that, yes, it's different, but it's more challenging. And for that reason, I think it should be funded. It should be funded better than what it is today.
Beautiful, position in relation to advocacy and that, and you've been involved with advocacy for a long time. Why did you get involved in, the medical politics type? What drove you to get involved in that?
So it's actually really interesting, because a couple of my early mentors, who shall remain nameless, were not super keen on advocacy, were quite cynical about it, and some of the activities or things that were going on back then. So my early career, I sort of wasn't very involved at all. I was involved as a medical student through Tropic and that sort of thing. And then in my early career, because I was so busy studying and everything, I sort of wasn't that involved. And some of my early mentors sort of didn't really guide me down that path. But it wasn't until none other than the Honourable Member Christian Rowan for Michael tapped me on the shoulder I think it was 2006, and they were having real trouble finding a president for RDAQ at the time, which is not unusual for our movement, because it's it's volunteer work, a lot of our work, and it can be challenging in the advocacy space to find the time and to do what we do. But they were really struggling and they couldn't find a president, and I'd come from a position of not being heavily involved in RDAQ, but Christian sat me down and said, look, I've seen you on a couple of committees, I think you could add some value to RDAQ. And, I went along to a few meetings and sort of the rest of it's history. And he encouraged me to apply. I became the president of RDAQ in 2007. I think that early experience working with some legends like Michael Rice in the RDAQ and some of the powerful stuff we did in the early days, advocating and legends like Sheila Cronin and Neil Beaton, these sort of people that were fearless and willing to take on government head on, that really appealed to me. Like, people that weren't going to sit back and be walked all over, that were going to take the cause of rural doctors head on. And I do think, I could see early on that they had influence, you know, and I used to say of our movement that we were punching above our weight. I think in the modern era, we're standing shoulder to shoulder with a lot of our other peaks and punching at the right way, because I think we're probably a lot more influential today even than we were then. But you know, certainly the idea to me of changing one line in policy in perpetuity and the impact that that could have on patients and communities, as opposed to sort of just seeing one patient at a time, really got me excited that, you know, you could have an influence above and beyond just trying to look after one patient at a time. It's a bit like, you know, teach Amanda Fish stuff. Like if we could change a couple of lines in policy, then we could have a big impact. And I saw that play out, you know, with RDAQ's influence over the maternity landscape in Queensland. And I think, and also, I don't think the rural generalist pathway in Queensland would have gotten up without the force and the backing of the RDAQ and the RDA movement generally. And I was there on the sidelines watching that evolve, and not you know, beyond my presidency, watching people like Adam Coltso talking to health ministers through that formative early stages of the formation of the rural generalist pathway in Queensland. And I could hand on my heart say I know that wouldn't have happened without the strong political pressure that was brought to bear by our movement on the then Queensland state government.
All right. Okay, I'm going to do a quick fire round. We do this with everybody that we talk to as part of our podcast series. So basically, I just ask the question, just the first thing that pops into your head. And you can take a little bit, you know, a couple of seconds to think about it, but take too long and I'll cut you off. Okay. All right.
Bring it.
If you weren't a rural doctor, what would you be?
Obstetrician.
Okay. Potts Point, Toowoomba or Stanthorpe? Okay.
I can't answer that one because they all were, to be honest, they were all equally had their pros and cons for me at the time of my life when I was there. So I enjoyed bits and pieces of all of them.
Fair enough. Favorite drink?
It would have to be, it's beer all the way.
Okay. Union, league or cricket?
League.
Okay. Your proud moment?
My proudest moment? Oh, look, it has to be the birth of the children, and particularly the first birth. Not that, you know, I have favorites, but it was that moment in life when you realize that you're responsible for another human being. You're genuinely 100% and completely responsible for another life. That really hit me like a freight train. And it was, you know, overwhelmingly emotional, but super proud of Tam and what she went through there as well, and what it meant for us as a family.
Best thing about rural medicine?
The diversity, like the range of work that we do, you know, being able to have a day in a life where you're doing a Caesar in the morning, you know, fixing a trauma in the afternoon, and, you know, maybe stitching someone up in the evening. It's that diversity.
Worst thing about rural medicine?
Oh, the on-call after hours. After a while, early on in your career, it's exciting and you know, it's got a bit of a buzz to it, but yeah, get to a point where you just get, you really don't like being woken up after midnight.
Okay, best thing about being the RDAA president?
Oh, look, it has to be the people. Yes, what I loved about it was the connection with the people and the relationship. I also, you know, pre my presidency, really enjoyed some of the travel and meeting face to face. One of the downers of COVID was we didn't get to experience as much of that, but I did like the engagement with the people, and I think and not just my colleagues like the team, Peter and the team there. It's been great working with them, but that face-to-face engagement with the politicians, the excitement of walking through the halls of Parliament House and seeing the history and feeling the politics in person, I think has been really rewarding.
Well, you may have already answered this, but worst thing about being RDAA president?
Oh yeah, it's got to be the Zoom meetings over COVID, particularly like back-to-back evening Zooms when you're already buggered after a long day.
Okay, RACGP, ACRM, or RACHMA?
ACRM all the way. Look, I'm so passionate about ACRM, and I've lived through the journey of its formation and know so many of the key players that have been so important in its formation. And what I think a lot of people think that we're just patriotically backing ACRM because it's rural. And I would say to people that would think that that's completely wrong. ACRM is based on very, very sound academic research. And a lot of the people that were responsible for founding ACRM were senior academics from JCU, people like Richard Murray and Ian Ronsky and Dennis Passion, Toran Sengupta. These are all people that I admire deeply, and I've been heavily involved in some of the academic side of ACRM, even curriculum development and curriculum review. And I've also been privy to the theory behind their assessment process and how they formed their assessment, how they validated their assessment. And ACRM's always used cutting edge sort of industry leading sort of education theory to build its product. So I don't think people quite appreciate the level of academic rigor behind ACRM. And I would say that for rural training, it definitely is fit for purpose. It's a curriculum that trains people in rural hospital practice, acute medicine, obstetrics, anesthetics, and a broad range of things as its core degree, including emergency medicine, that the RACGP just doesn't do. It's not to say it's better or worse, but there are things that the ACRM product delivers that RACGP doesn't deliver. And I think that it's based on really strong industry-leading academic rigor. So, and also, again, some amazing people. And Marita's a good friend of mine, and she leads a fantastic team of some really passionate and effective professionals that are delivering rural training in Australia today.
Okay, just before we finish up, I've got one last question. What's the best piece of advice that you've ever been given, or what would be the piece of advice you'd give to your intern self on day one?
Oh, look, I would, I think back to my intern self, I would say back yourself. And I would say it's not going to be as bad as you think. I think as really junior doctors, we have a lot of fear of the unknown. I would say you are going to be backed up by your senior colleagues, because that's certainly what I experienced. But also to, have a crack and make sure that you put yourself into positions and give yourself the opportunity, put yourself forward so that you learn. One of the realities of becoming a rural doctor is you do have to accelerate your learning compared to your colleagues. I think if you're going to get the breadth and the depth of knowledge that you need over the time frame of rural training, which is quite accelerated when you think about the range of things we have to learn. So, and to get that, particularly in the modern era, you've really got to put yourself forward. The other piece of advice I think I would give to my old self, so John in 1999, would have been do a second advanced skill. That's one of the biggest regrets that I have in my career is that I was given, back in the day, it was sort of unheard of to do it was when the RG was pre-formation, but the theory behind it was out there. And the advice from most of my mentors was do one, and that's how it's all going to look. But if I had my time again, I would have done anesthetics and obstetrics. And I feel like I would have been able to contribute better to many of the models of care that I worked in, because many times I've been out as an obstetrician and they've needed someone else on the anaesthetic roster. Those two skills in particular, I've found are very much needed, as much as, you know, people like to spruik the value of cognitive disciplines, and each area of medicine is equally important and needed in the community. But when you're building a roster in a rural town that's trying to deliver an obstetric service and you don't have an anaesthetist, you can't have on call. This is why places go on bypass. So it's actually comes back to the pragmatics of delivering a service, and many of our services are still really challenged in the range of those advanced skills that they can provide.
Well, Dr. John Hall, I've known you for many years, and you've been my boss, my colleague, and my friend. And I thank you for your time this morning for our Destination Rural podcast series.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's been a pleasure.